Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cantor Scott Gercken. I'm at St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church and School in Brookfield, Illinois. And my topic this morning is teaching music classically. What does this mean? Now, I observe there are about 30 people in this room, which is about 30 people more than I was originally expecting. So I am humbled and honored by your presence, and I am a first-time speaker at CCLE. Lord have mercy. Because music is one of the 7 ancient liberal arts, it has a rightful and prominent place in classical education. And to want to teach music according to classical principles is a very good thing. But to name music as one of those 7 arts of the free man, liberal arts, does little good if we remain ignorant about what in fact is being named as music and how it fits with arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy within the quadrivium. To know how to teach music according to classical principles in our own time and place, we need to wrestle with questions of content and method and arrive at a solution that would be approved by ancient wisdom, yet remain recognizable today as an education in music that is not only good, true, and beautiful, but sublimely so. On the end of the spectrum closest to the ancients, we can take as our guide what they wrote about the nature and teaching of music. But on the other end, closest to our time and our American milieu, we find something easier to recognize as music education, but harder to justify on classical principles. So, is there a middle way? I think so. What I do in the context of a classical Lutheran school comports with our understanding that classical Lutheran education teaches children to look to God in faith and to our neighbor in love by means of the 6 chief parts and the 7 liberal arts. Now, if you skipped the definition essay portion of what is classical Lutheran education, there, I gave it to you in a nutshell. I believe classical Lutheran education is teaching children to look to God in faith and to their neighbor, serve their neighbor in love by means of the 6 chief parts and the 7 liberal arts. And of course, I should say 6 chief parts of Luther's small catechism, 7 liberal arts, trivium, quadrivium. I'm pretty sure we're okay on that. The 7 liberal arts gives us the tools of language and number that apply so broadly and richly that students would be able to apply them to any field of study or human endeavor, or even those endeavors in the servile arts. Your school's priorities in classical education may be different, and I can only leave to your judgment what teaching music classically will look like in your school. I would not be so bold as to title this session, "How to Teach Music Classically," as if I were an unassailable authority on the subject. I am not. My goal here today is to guide you where I have gone in my thinking and about what that might mean. And I will raise questions along the way that I hope will move you toward a meet, right, and salutary answer to the question, what might it mean to teach music classically? Or perhaps idealistically, what would it look like if we were to teach music according to classical principles and didn't have to compromise? Let's get to some hints from history about what the content of a classical education in music could or should be. So who are the authorities? In geometry, who is our classical thinker in geometry? Anyone? Euclid, of course. How about rhetoric? Aristotle, Cicero. Go a little bit later and you hit people like Quintilian. Quintilian's a great resource on rhetoric. How about music? Crickets. And that's for reasons. That's for reasons. I'm going to say that we could look to Pythagoras, we could look to Plato, we could look to Ptolemy, we could look to Nicomachus. But there was one figure in the late classic or early medieval period who synthesized in Latin the musical thinking of all of those men, and his treatise became the reigning music theory textbook from the 6th to the 9th century AD. His name was Boethius. He wrote a very important musical treatise called De Institutione Musica. Now, he wrote, supposedly, on all four of the quadrivial arts, and by the way, he gives us the term quadrivium. There we go. But his music treatise is what we have the most of, and we don't have all of it. But it was a subject of study in the 20th century. He also wrote a very famous work called The Consolation of Philosophy, a treatise he wrote on death row. And he had a rather famous disciple named Cassiodorus. He's worth looking up. If you ever meet John Hill, just mention Cassiodorus and he'll lecture on it for 3 days. Oh wait, that was CCLE 2013. Okay, that's great. I love Dr. Hill. Boethius' treatise on music clearly justifies music as the art of the free man, but that justification is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, there's a fair bit of philosophy involved. In the words of Nicholas Bell, quote, "The extensive discussions of instrumental music were intended not simply as an exemplification of the geometrical principles of harmonic theory, they were also the first stage in an intellectual progression. The study of music was alone in providing such a direct link between concrete understandings and divine cosmology." Boethius relishes speculating about music as what I would call the rhetoric of ratio, revealed in vibrations of sound, musica instrumentalis, in the oscillation of the spheres, musica, anyone? Mundana, and the passions of the heart, musica humana. Because ratio and harmony are the same thing in his mind, all of this is subsumed under his definition of music. The totality of that is what the Greeks and Romans recommended for study as one of the 7 liberal arts. On the other hand, Boethius has a definition for a musician that will probably rattle us pretty badly. Boethius defines a musician in Book 1, Chapter 24 of his De Musica, and David S. Chamberlain summarizes it this way: "The true musician is one who knows and judges by reason the proportions of music, and not the one who judges them by the senses, or who only composes them or plays them skillfully. The instrumentalist and the poet are engaged in music, but neither can truly be called musicus." Whew. Yikes. Here's the sharp distinction: musicianship as the liberal art and bardcraft as the bonossic and servile art. It's almost like asking the question, who is worthier to be called a warrior, the soldier on the battlefield or the general in the war room? Who is worthier to be called musician, the one who actually puts music into a listener's ears, or the music theorist? As a member of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, or as a music critic writing for the Chicago Tribune? But that's not why the West set Boethius aside. Not yet. There were practical reasons to do so. The 8th century saw the development of counterpoint. Music to that point had but one melodic line to manage. The moment you have 2 voices sounding in harmony instead of unison, Boethius has nothing to say. Claude Poliska, who, if you took undergraduate music history sequence in the past 30 years, probably wrote your textbook, said in 1987 that Boethius was revered and maligned in the Renaissance, mostly for the wrong reasons. He was cast in the alien role of musical lawgiver to a culture dedicated to polyphony, a kind of music he never knew. This is a problem for us because a world that knows only monophony to the exclusion of other textures like homophony, polyphony, monody, or even heterophony is one that we've never known. We would find it unrecognizable. Around the 8th century as well, there was an increased interest in accurate transmission of music by way of notation without the aid of oral tradition. Boethius' treatise is usually printed with numerous diagrams, but these are not what we would call sheet music or even tablature. Boethius does not address the problem of music notation. This development also demonstrates a heightened interest in musical performance of a body of repertoire. Several centuries later, Boethius's allusions to scalar and rhythmic modes might still have been relevant, but his presupposition that all the earthly and heavenly harmonies work out in divinely simple ratios didn't age well by proving mathematically untenable. If you want to know more about this problem, look up a YouTube video called Why It's Impossible to Tune a Piano from Minute Physics. That's all one word, Minute Physics. Basically, it works like this. Musical intervals that evenly divide the octave by Pythagorean proportions, like 9 to 8 for a whole tone, also known as major second, actually render an out-of-tune octave, which would be at a frequency ratio of 2 to 1. So if I go over here, that C would be X amount of vibrations per second, and this would be half that number. It's an octave relationship. But if you compound intervals, that would add up, such as major second. By the time you compound that 9 to 8 ratio, how many times is that? 6 times? You don't get 2 to 1. In fact, you can't. It's called the rational root theorem. So that works like this. For any integers a, b, and n, with n being greater than 1, then a over b to the nth power can't equal 2. That's why the music of the spheres doesn't work in music. Because you cannot take even the circle of fifths, which will get you this C at the top will not be in tune if you do the 3 to 2 ratios all the way up the piano. It does not work. It can't work. Pythagoras didn't know that. Boethius didn't know that either. He was a mathematician of the highest degree, but he hadn't figured that out yet. This either leads us to skew our tuning schemes to favor good harmony in one key at the expense of bad intonation in others, or we have to make everything equally out of tune. Well-tempered clavier, anyone? So in music history, both have been tried, but we've landed today on that latter option. Today, the frequency difference between adjacent half steps is actually a ratio of the 12th root of 2 to 1. That's an irrational number. That's not one of those low-value integers that's integer ratios that's going to be the picture of simplicity now, is it? That's like the exact opposite. So as far as the proportional ordering of the soul, I'll simply confess that the Christian doctrine precludes me from believing that a tonal or rhythmic mode falling upon my ears has the capacity to steer my soul toward evil or good, coram hominibus. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the word of God, as St. Paul reminds us in Romans 10:17. There is no one who does good, not even one. As a Christian, any work that is truly good is made good by the Holy Spirit, and it's the Holy Spirit's working through the word that makes and keeps me righteous in his sight. Music has no spirit of its own to work good or evil. Alas, it seems that Boethius, or at least his treatise on music, is not going to be a reliable guide, because it has roundly obsolesced itself. Boethius' understanding of music seems quite foreign to our experience. Now, we have to ask ourselves, okay, this musical mastermind of yesteryear is not going to be a valid guide, and wouldn't even be recognizable in today's context. So what is recognizable in our context? Can we go back any length of time in our American experience and find something that approximates classical education in music? If we look at public schooling, especially in the United States of America, the answer is no. Because it was progressivist from its inception. What you may find surprising is that models for music education in American schools, even early on, were very much concerned with the ordering of the human soul. But to what end? Horace Mann, the father of American public education and a lapsed Calvinist, believed that universal schooling would go a long way toward regenerating the American society he saw in deterioration all around him. Mann recognized the moral benefit of religious training for the young, but it may be assumed from his legislative maneuvering in Massachusetts especially, that he believed those moralistic benefits could not only be divorced from the religious institutions that preserved them, but that such benefits could and should be applied liberally to students in state-run schools, even by force. Gabriel Comparet, pardon my French, a biographer of man, notes, quote, the vague mysticism that floats over things man said, like, quote, the spiritual essence of man contemplates directly the spiritual essence of the universe. Musica mundana, anyone? Musica humana? But the biographer also notes that, quote, from this religious spirit, all dogma, all formal credo is banished. Belief in an all-powerful creator, in a God of goodness, and in an immortality of happiness alone survive in Horace Mann's religion. Toward that end, he found that Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi's pedagogy, built on philosophy of Rousseau, had been doing just that. Pestalozzi's dates are 1746 to 1827. Keep that in mind. What was going on at that time? Got it. It was after Pestalozzi's death that his school in Yverdon, Switzerland, received Mann as a visitor in 1843, who, upon his return, observed that in the school, music, quote, was everywhere in evidence. The teachers were masters of vocal music, and they played upon one or more instruments as well. One was as certain, he said, to see a violin as a blackboard in every room. Singing was taught not only as an accomplishment, but as a means of recreation and, every homeschooler's favorite word, socialization. It should be noted that during that visit, Mann finally observed for himself a kind of music education that was brought to his approving attention 6 years prior. Here's how he learned about it in the first place. William Channing Woodbridge observed music classes in Pestalozzi's school and ostensibly returned to the US with a copy of the music teaching manual developed there. It was called Gesangbildungslehre nach Pestalozzischen Grundsätzen, or Method of Teaching Singing According to Pestalozzian Principles. And it was written by Pestalozzi's musical disciples Hans-Georg Nägeli and Michael Traugott Pfeiffer. The first author, Nägeli, had established singing classes in Swiss schools because he believed that group singing would promote social unity and religious values, as well as stimulate a desire for good music. That method book's notion of what constituted good music showed a strong bias against what? Any guesses? The German Lutheran chorale, which had as its goal Christian formation through musical proclamation of Christian doctrine. Put another way, the goal of the chorale is Christian catechesis. Any catechetical emphasis for music instruction was obviated in Pestalozzian schools. Rote learning and exact recitation of previously learned material was not considered a valid course of instruction. But that's the book Woodbridge wanted to translate for use in the United States, and he worked with singing school instructor Elam Ives to do it. Eventually, the two shared their efforts with the great American church musician and music teacher Lowell Mason, 1792 to 1872, if you're playing the home game. Mere months after he published what probably was the first American songbook written specifically for children. 1829, it was called The Juvenile Psalmist. During the next 2 years, Ives and Mason compiled a book incorporating Pestalozzian pedagogy entitled The Juvenile Lyre, L-Y-R-E, Hymns and Songs, Religious, Moral, and Cheerful for the Use of Primary and Common Schools, released in 1831. This book may have been the first songbook of its kind written for pupils in American public schools. In 1834, Mason published the Manual of the Boston Academy of Music for instruction in the elements of vocal music on the system of Pestalozzi under his own name, but drew heavily upon Nägeli and Pfeiffer's Gesangbildungslehre and another work by G.F. Kubler, such that accusations of plagiarism were absolutely warranted. The Boston Academy of Music was a private venture of Woodbridge, Mason, and others to advocate for vocal music instruction in common schools. It brought forward 2 proposals to the Massachusetts Board of Education for including vocal music in the primary school curriculum. Horace Mann and the rest of the board approved of the experiment in 1837, with Lowell Mason teaching music at the Hawes Primary School. In 1838, the board officially approved the inclusion of vocal music in the curriculum. Other cities started to notice the inroads school music had made in Boston and seeking to, quote, achieve moral, communal, physical, and educational goals. Boards of education from the Northeast, with a growing number of schools moving westward, adopted musical study. With this cast of teachers, legislators, and philosophers staged thus, music education in American public schools was born, with Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi as the godfather in Switzerland. By the 20th century, public schools were supporting various instrumental ensembles as well. After the American Civil War, ex-military bandsmen formed touring bands that popularized the band medium. Patrick S. Gilmore, John Philip Sousa were both highly influential in this regard. Sousa's celebrity status as a director of a professional touring band, following his tenure directing the United States Marine Band, added a great deal of visibility to his support of school bands at the local and the university level. Touring orchestras such as that of Theodore Thomas, who served as director of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and later founded the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, developed local interest in school orchestras and string classes. And once again, music education in Boston became the pattern for the nation when Albert Mitchell, Charles Farnsworth, and Paul Stoving developed after school and later during school violin classes using a European model found in Maidstone, England. The inclusion of strings curriculum in American public schools tended to lag behind the more popular band programs, but became more common as the 20th century progressed. Ideologically speaking, the principles of Pestalozzi were at least partially responsible for the idea of instrumental education and promoting that to school boards. By emphasizing the extra musical and societal benefits of these ensembles, music educators and school administrators garnered substantial support for them, especially during World War I. As a result, bands had acquired an official place in school schedules by 1923 and held regular rehearsals under the direction of trained and salaried, though usually uncertified, musicians. Especially in wartime, music educators and school administrators wanted for their schools what Pestalozzi wanted for his: a source of local and patriotic pride coupled with positive feelings of camaraderie and cooperativeness. Proficiency in instrumental music may have been seen as an accomplishment, but it was also a means of recreation and socialization. As greater numbers of Americans gained access to live musical performances by way of professional touring bands and orchestras, music teachers began to wonder, quote, whether traditional music instruction went far enough since it did not include information about music theory, musical structure, and the like. Did the common public school curriculum, quote, failed to reach large numbers of potential concert goers such that those who did attend concerts did not know enough about music to enjoy it thoroughly, as music teachers feared? Beginning in 1903, Frances Elliott Clark, known for her work as music supervisor for the Milwaukee Public Schools, sought from 2 school principals permission to use the Victor talking machine. Ever heard of that thing? For teaching music appreciation classes. This being granted, her early efforts in what we would consider today music technology laid out a general pattern for the nation for the teaching of music appreciation. The Victor Talking Machine Company eventually brought her on staff as the director of their first educational department. So, what should we do now? Boethius is not a helpful guide for day-to-day curriculum. The American public school model is a grand adventure in missing the point because it sees music as a means to progressive ends, to the exclusion of considering music to be a good, true, and beautiful end in itself. Where do we look for a model. At which master's feet shall we sit? Good guess, but we're going later. The answer is buried in the question. We do sit at the feet of masters. In classical education, of course, we value mastery in fields of study. This touches on a problem with Boethius. We do not need to elevate the performer or the theorist, the composer or the critic over the other. This should be obvious when we identify great masters of Western music and look at their credentials. If Boethius had met Johann Sebastian Bach, a learned, freeborn master of music in literally every respect, whose instrumental facility could have put any music-making slave of Boethius's day to shame, Boethius would have to eat his words. This is an example of the Christian doctrine of vocation, easing the tension between musicianship and bardcraft. Let's consider Johann Sebastian Bach. As a student, he learned counterpoint by copying scores, even staying up nights and raiding his cousin's music cabinet, therefore devaluing his collection of music. That's why he got a real sound beating for that one. He learned music through private, directed study from a master. He had experience as a choir boy in churches, and he certainly didn't sit on a carpet square playing ostinati on sandblocks, finger cymbals, and Orff instruments. As a teacher, he wrote for his students and put other masterworks in front of them as being worthy of their study and the church's edification. His students were familiar with the hymnody of the church. When he was producing cantatas for every week in Leipzig, his workload was 2 days to compose, 2 days to copy out parts with his family and students, 2 days to rehearse, 1 day to perform, twice. Once at the Nikolai Kirche in the morning, and then the Thomas Kirche in the afternoon, and then the next week it would switch. His students were assigned musical roles and to churches. Bach was in charge of the music in 4 churches in Leipzig. His students were assigned to musical roles and to churches according to their ability. The boys in his charge were otherwise receiving a classical Lutheran education according to the reforms of Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Johannes Bugenhagen, and others. Bach at various times was also the boys' Latin teacher, although I've heard tell of a book that actually questioned his chops as a Latinist. Okay, I question my chops as a Latinist too, but I asked to teach music and Latin to my students too. I think our solution is, consider everything that his students got. Christian formation through interaction with cantata and hymn texts, intimate knowledge of counterpoint, technical facility as performers in voice or in one or more instruments, unquestionable musical literacy, all in the service of the proclamation of the Word of God. Those were all things that Pestalozzian music pedagogy repudiated. I think our solution is, or at least happens to, embrace everything Pestalozzi was reacting against. So what might this mean? First of all, everyone needs to sing, both individually and as a group, with one instrument that God gave you at birth. This needs to happen especially in classes that are not titled music classes. Have a hymn memorization curriculum. Started at the youngest level of your school. Select hymns that teach the content of the faith. Martin Luther wrote hymns paraphrasing the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and frankly, good English translations of them are easy to find. Any Christian can sing them. Sing psalm paraphrases. By the way, we like to say, the Reformed and the Presbyterians have done a really good job with hymn paraphrases. You know who pioneered that medium? Luther. From depths of woe I cry to thee. That was the very first psalm paraphrase, modern psalm paraphrase in hymnic form. The Calvinists just took it and ran. Good for them. Sing hymns appropriate to the times of the church year and to your church's lectionary. And don't feel like you have to do it all in music class. Sing the jingles appropriate to other subjects like you would do for Shirley English. Do we have school administrators in the room? One. Another back there? Okay. I would encourage your teachers to model proper technique with their students in their classrooms without canned or pre-recorded accompaniment as much as possible. And watch out for I love her dearly, I have a colleague, but I try to help her out as much as possible, and she's receptive to the help. And she's a fairly good musician, teaches music on the side privately, guitar and piano. But watch out for septuagenarian woman in the tenor section syndrome. If you have a female teacher who has allowed their voice to drop such that singing in the treble clef staff is a hardship for them, it might be a good idea to limit how much leading of the children's voice happens with their own voice, lest those children's voices be dragged below middle C where their voices do not belong. Correct starting pitches are so important. In fact, if you can, never let a child under age 10 be led to sing below middle C. Now, I understand there's a lot of Lutheran service book. You're going to encounter the B flat every once in a while. However, my school is, we use God's hymnal. This is TLH from 1941. We love it to death, and we do it to the nines. I would even say, if you are hiring a classroom teacher, ask them to sing a hymn they're choosing in an interview. If they can't do it, don't hire them. I wouldn't. I'll leave it up to you. Of course, it's your school. But ask them to sing a hymn, because if they can't lead you, how are they going to lead children? Which strategy is going to produce more competent, classically trained musician? Option 1, offering applied musical study of any instrument, including voice, with a chamber ensemble component, or option 2, having a large ensemble with a private lesson component. Always go for option 1 if you can. Now that kind of goes against our modern thinking of, oh, we got to have band, we got to have choir, we got to have orchestra. Okay, that's good, but there's better. Ask any ensemble director, who are your strongest players? And consistently they are going to say, oh, it's the ones that have a private teacher. We often refer to musicians as being classically trained. This is for good reason. They've been made to work through the grammar, logic, and rhetoric of their Western musical discipline. Let's consider ensembles. Ensembles are not bad, but they're not all equal. If you're going to teach music by means of an ensemble rehearsal, favor a medium that requires individual students to handle complete musical ideas from start to finish. Now, what kind of musical ensemble, by definition, can't do that? Ding. Ensembles of handbells, boom whackers, choir chimes, Orff instruments derive musical performances the way assembly line products are pieced together with unskilled labor, rather than individual competence as a musical artisan plying his craftsmanship. These tools could be used for other things, like accompaniments of choral literature or giving starting pitches. I'm not saying don't do it at all. Just don't make that your first and primary means of musical instruction for students. That's got to be secondary. I'm actually considering using boom whackers to teach about permutations, algorithms, and English method ringing. That's not something Lutherans actually have a strong tradition of, because if we have a bell at all, we have one, maybe two. But if you have an entire, and this is not carillon, but if you have an entire set of tower bells that get rung in an order, you can do what are called peals, sometimes half peals, quarter peals, usually quarter peals, because it's going to go through a set of permutations. That's an interesting math lesson that you might be able to try. I haven't done it yet, but I'm thinking about it. You could do a recorder choir or a strings class, and that's going to require a greater degree of musical mastery from individual students than with a separates choir, in which participants wait their turn to play one or two pitches they've been assigned. It's probably better if ensembles are treated as auxiliary to applied musical instruction. But when ensembles are called for, prioritize ensembles that have lain within the purview of musical masters worthy of study. Choir and orchestra are going to provide the richest repertoire available to students. As classical educators, we want to teach from primary sources, not secondary sources or tertiary sources as much. If we want to put students in touch with the masterworks of the West's greatest musical minds, we should prefer performing works themselves in their native idiom, not arrangements or transcriptions of those works. And that's the problem with band, isn't it? It's a 19th century ambulatory ensemble established for military and ceremonial purposes. And it really wasn't until the 1870s that bands were concerned with playing transcriptions of orchestral literature or having music of such high quality written for those ensembles. Ray Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst, and Percy Grainger were some of the first composers to embrace band as a worthy instrumental medium, and they are masters to be sure. Their music really speaks to my former band director heart. I was a band director in public schools for 7 years, and I love their music. But I have to realize that it has a place, but it might not be in my school, and that's okay. But why would we cut ourselves off from Vivaldi, Bach, Handel, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Wagner, Brahms, and others who never wrote for band? Because performing their works as a band requires transcription and or arrangement, students can't interact with their music in its natural idiom. And we're cutting them off from them for what good reason? This makes why band, not orchestra, an extremely important and potent question. If you want to pull the curtain back on what's really important to school administration when they have a band and not an orchestra, ask that question. For a lot of our counterparts in public and progressivist schools, there are bands and not orchestras because orchestras don't play at ball games and really shouldn't play outdoors, but that's a different issue. They're of no use to athletic departments. They don't march in parades. They don't win trophies that anybody important cares about. They don't play covers of popular music, usually, and it isn't nearly as useful for community relations. On this point also, we have to beware the pitfalls of maintaining a whiz-bang, top-shelf touring ensemble of any kind. Maybe it's a chamber orchestra, a madrigal choir, or a wind symphony. There can be a very fine line between using these ensembles to teach music at an advanced level and there being little more than the school's face that launched 1,000 scholarships. You'll know there's a problem with the ensemble's academic integrity if a good music teacher gets let go for not generating enough income on tour. That's a good indication that the school is not thinking about music instruction classically. Let's consider music theory. At the earliest ages, we can teach scales, solfege, steady beat, have students copy music notation, and echo back what we sing. And as time goes on, we should be able to extend music theory into sight singing. And I think a good foundation in that should be present before you hand the child an instrument that isn't their own voice. Just thinking aloud, what if we taught perfect pitch in schools? You ever think about that? Many years ago, I observed the beginning of a band rehearsal. I was a student teacher. The conductor asked his high schoolers out of the blue to sing a concert B-flat before they played one note as an ensemble. Now, if I had a band in here, I would do that same trick. If they're going to start playing a B-flat major scale, and they've done that every band rehearsal since they were able to play the entire 8 notes of the B-flat major scale, that might be baked into their soul, just a tiny bit. So they kind of looked at each other sheepishly, and they earballed a B-flat. Horns up, let's play a concert B-flat. Oh, hey, it worked. What they sang was very much in the ballpark of what they played in their horns. And this shows that you can absorb one pitch into your head quite by accident if you're aware that you have absorbed it and have a good grasp of intervals. And you can find any other pitch. But perfect pitch is not just a you either have it or you don't phenomenon. It can be taught. And it yields its best success when training starts by age 6. Pitch relationships are established by a cardinal pitch and intervals away from that, which is why Gregorian chant notation is not beholden to A is 440 hertz, or 442 if you play with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. But nowadays, by convention, whatever we call G has to be a G for everyone, just like what we call red is red for everyone, and likewise blue, yellow, or any other color. And yet it seems we've seen the limp along for centuries in music classes like art students who don't know their colors. Maybe we can avoid that. Maybe second or third semester college music theory and aural skills wouldn't seem so out of reach for a high school senior. Consider music appreciation. At an elementary level, the more you can get teachers to integrate music history into their classroom's general history grammar, the better. At St. Paul's in Brookfield, we use the Brummett-Taylor Music Listening Program, a non-directed approach, from Tall Timbers Publishing Corporation for about 5 minutes a day during the school lunch period. Again, that's called, if you want to write it down, Brummett-Taylor, 2 M's, 2 T's, Taylor, Music Listening Program, a non-directed approach, and it's from Tall Timbers Publishing Corporation. We listen to the same musical example every day of the week for about 5 minutes. And there is a script that goes along with it. There's a slightly different script I read ahead of the music being played. And this familiarizes them with the well-known classical music and gives them the opportunity for multiple hearings. There are 5 years worth of curriculum in the first book, and there's a supplement that adds another 3 years and several more recordings. At the end of each listening, I put a question to them about the music or the composer that anybody can look up and answer at lunch the following day. Sometimes I vary the recordings the students hear. I'll play the provided recording one day, and I'll play one on a recording made with, say, period instruments, especially if we're doing Bach or Handel. Losing my place here. If it's ballet music, they'll see an excerpt of the ballet production. Then the next day, maybe it's a transcription. There's your area for transcription. Transcription for, I don't know, tuba euphonium ensemble. And then maybe if time and ability permits, on the last day, the students get a mini recital from yours truly. I can play a lot of the two-part inventions pretty well. So this is a fairly painless way to carry out music appreciation in the curriculum, and I'm not doing it during the music period. And if there are pieces you want to cover that aren't in the set, duplicating this pattern is very, very easy. And I've been trying to develop my own curriculum that's appropriate for a classical Lutheran school, but I figure there are at least 2 other books I need to finish writing before I get to that one. There are lots of different off-the-shelf methodologies and textbooks for teaching general music. On principle, I don't usually trust them, but I very much believe that the teacher should be the textbook. That doesn't mean that you don't put sheet music in front of your students. Definitely do that when, in your judgment, it is the right thing to do. And I know that there are curricular resources for music from classically minded publishers, but I haven't looked into them myself, mostly because the entire time that I had been teaching music in a classical Lutheran school, I was also doing full-time graduate work. So time was precious. So rest assured, I'm not trying to turn a professional development workshop into a paid advertisement for anything. Let's see, 2 summers ago, I did undergo John Feyerabend's conversational solfege training. I am certified in levels 1 and 2. And I was curious about it because there are some Lutheran schools. There is a music director up by me who is very much into it and thinks it's the best thing for Lutheran school music, and I had to go, okay, well, if somebody has strong feelings about that, I better look into it. It takes a sound before sight linguistic approach to music literacy and mixes elements of kodai or folk dancing toward the goal of students becoming tuneful, beatful, and artful. That's their 3 things: tuneful, beatful, artful. And those are good things, but I do have reservations. The curriculum is synthesized from a lot of progressivist music pedagogy, but being a competent musician relies so heavily on good fundamentals, a good grasp of the grammar of music, if you will, that sometimes the broken clock is somehow right more than twice a day. Also, the curriculum borrows from Zoltan Kodai's approach, which assumes that a music teacher would build from the foundation of the student's native folk music. And in his context, that meant that there were a lot of minor thirds. Okay. Hello, how are you? Okay, that's a little bit different, but what Feyerabend did is said, okay, in the American context, there's a lot of do, re, mi. We start with that, and then we might go get our first 4 notes of the pentatonic scale, etc. So in his, Feyerabend has done a lot of work to think along those lines. How am I doing on time?
You have about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I think we can do this. So the problem with this is for our Lutheran school context, our body of folk music is what? Yeah. If we want to pass, we don't want to necessarily pass on folk music, but the Lutheran chorale. And that's a body of repertoire that predates time signatures and key signatures. Kind of hard to be beatful and artful when you're going back and forth between patterns of 2 and patterns of 3. A lot of it's modal, both tonally and rhythmically. Some of it is modified plain chant. Some of it is straight up plain chant. This is the source material for Bach cantatas. And that's our musical heritage as Lutherans. Feyerabend's curriculum short circuits with Easter hymns like I am content, my Jesus liveth still. He can't do anything with young children with that hymn. He'd say, okay, if you introduce that, that's like putting coins in the bank, you'll cash them in later. Okay, but they're still going to sing it every Easter, multiple times if you're in my school. I teach this to our youngest students, but the first 4 pitches go up in a whole tone scale. Do, re, mi, fi. Oh boy. And it sets up this delightfully awkward feeling of being so elated by the resurrection of Christ that you can't decide which dance to dance first. The best the conversational solfege curriculum can say is that learning that and singing that oddball rhythm is like putting pennies into the bank. However, I haven't seen that the conversational solfege curriculum ever gets to the point where mastery of those scalar and rhythmic conventions are going to be the next thing on the list to knock out. As we draw to a close, keep in mind that if we don't already have access to people who have put together a bona fide classical curriculum in music, we're not completely without a guide. Music is music, and if you have mastery of the content of music as a discipline, you are a sufficient textbook for your students, and you can assemble a curriculum that meets your classical school's goals. From the standpoint of method, whatever you teach in music, be mindful of the grammar, the logic, and rhetoric of the concept you're teaching. Grammar, the elements of X have names. Logic, the elements of X work together in predictable ways. Rhetoric, the elements of X can be directed toward a goal. Also, remember to go to the source. Go ad fontes. Identify the masters of the art, study their work, perform their work, and eliminate the editor. Our cultural milieu is bent on dismembering or divorcing good, true, and beautiful things that belong together. I believe that when we approach a classical education in music as Christians, we should offer something similar to what Johann Sebastian Bach offered his students that recognizes that music in the service of the proclamation of the Word of God is sublime, not optional, frivolous, or cheap. Especially not cheap edutainment that will socialize us into a happier, healthier us. I'll leave you with this word of encouragement that Martin Luther wrote to one Ludwig Zenfel, and it beautifully reflects his own understanding of music as an art of the quadrivium in the service of the Word of God. Quote, Music and theology alone are capable of giving peace and happiness to troubled souls. This plainly proves that the devil, the source of all unhappiness and worries, flees music as much as he does theology. This is why the prophets practiced music as they did no other art. They did not link their theology to geometry, nor to arithmetic, nor to astronomy, but to music. Ever see those poetic lines in the prophecies? It's poetry, but poetry is always sung, especially at that time. They linked it to music, and through music, they preached the truth with songs and psalms. So it seems to me that if you want to teach music classically, do that. Thank you very much.